Okay, here we are on Thursday morning, 10 a.m. Hopefully we are at home and warm because it's kind of chilly out there. And I'm rather glad that we don't, hello, I'm kind of glad we don't have to go anywhere. So hopefully everyone's got the heat on and we're going to take advantage of this sort of quarantine thing because it's minus 17 or something outside. I'm not sure. It's chilly. Okay. Today I've got a whole bunch of things to cover. I've made my list and I want to make sure I don't go too far off track because we'll talk about Arthur Rimbaud, we'll talk about urban space, a little bit about Lefebvre, and also in the Kristen Ross book, I asked you just to read the introduction. Then we'll talk about some of the SI readings. So lots of things to look at and think about and talk about. But before I go any further, I just wanted to ask you, generally speaking, am I really front loading this course with a lot of readings, or are you fairly comfortable with the amount and the time that I've allotted you to read? Because I'd like some feedback on that, if everyone is okay with it, because when you teach at Fanshawe, students are very reluctant to read a postcard. So to ask you to read 30 or 40 pages, I'm like, this is too much. Is the amount about enough? Okay, I get one thumbs up, many likes, a couple of cares, a few sads. Okay, all right. So I'm going to keep it like this. Also, too, as we move into sort of the next sections, these are sort of chapters that I had written in the book that I divided in half. So if you don't have a chance to finish the readings for that particular week, don't panic, because basically that 2-week section of the module will be covering all those general ideas. So what I've done is I've kind of begin paring back a little bit on the reading so that I wanted to front load the SI stuff. And then in the second half, some of the secondary material that is important in informing the ideas that influence the SI, such as Henri Lefebvre, that we'll go back and revisit. But I just wanted to make sure that the actual reading amount is not too overwhelming, because I know too that you're reading, in this case, unless you own the book, you're reading online and you're reading on the screen. And I know that, my eyes get tired after a while of doing that. I'm lucky enough to have a copy of, for example, the Ken Knabb book, this one here. So I can sit and leisurely go through it. So I just want to make sure it's not too top loaded. Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask you about too is we're now in week 3, and I was talking about the short drafts or short kind of papers that I had mentioned the first time we got together as kind of the first part of this scaffolded series of projects. One is the short draft of 5 to 7 pages at the most. Second is the student presentation, along with the kind of Q&A that follows it. And then the final paper at the end, the final research paper. At this point now, have some of you begun thinking about some ideas that you wish to pursue, given the fact that the readings are fairly broad in the sense that I wanted to make sure that we had a chance to touch on many of the different ideas that are presented in the work of the SI, this kind of the critique of work, early ideas about the society of the spectacle, this sort of rampant anti-capitalist ideas that are seeking to, in a sense, reformulate society along very different lines that are more humanistic and less economic. Does anyone want to have sort of a few minutes to talk about sort of things that they're thinking about but may not sure where to go? Because I know there's a lot of stuff that you can look at, and depending on your own interests, whether they're art history or philosophy or literature, there's a lot to think about. This is sort of a multi-pronged approach to dealing with the everyday world that the SI were, in hindsight, became very famous for. And they also sit on the cusp of modernism segueing into postmodernism. One of the readings talks about, everything is a parody. Everything's a parody of what's going on. And at the time, the writing, right, this is 1958, 59, 60, it's on the cusp of what we now call postmodernism. So there's already in the air the notion that everything's just being parroted and being repeated. Now it becomes important because when we think of the fact that the past is crushing, the present, at that time it was more of a Marxist notion. But surprisingly, it becomes something that is much more than simply Marxist. It's this idea that it's hard to be original in this postmodern world that we are now living in. It's hard to be unique and original in thought and in behavior or in writing, because we do end up parroting and parodying things that are already out there. We recontextualize things, we reformulate things. But this notion of the relationship with the past becomes something increasingly important and difficult at this early time. So even within the SI's writings, there is this already an awareness that coming up with something really unique is not easy. And this is what they're trying to do. Some of it is bonkers, to say the least. At least it's a little odd, because that's kind of one of the things about the SI. If you were to the proverbial elevator pitch, if someone were to ask you, well, what do they do? Like, what do these people do? It's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to say in a few sentences what a situation is, because we're talking about urban ambiances, and we're talking about behavioral modifications, and it's not easy to pin down. And that was intentional, right? It was intentional because it was concerned more with the behavior in relation to the milieu, right? The environment in which this occurs, rather than something dogmatic, right? It must be the following. There was a lot of freedom, a lot of experimenting with what might work in one space at one time versus a different space at a different time. And all of these things are being worked out sort of in texts or in public, in the social spaces. But they will say, at the very least, tried very hard to be original. And some of it was a little flaky and maybe not practical. But I think they were ready to, try different things. And we'll see over time, as we continue to revisit some of these readings, as we move further into the late 60s, we find them increasingly political. A lot of the ideas that are presented at this early stage in the writings that I asked you to look at for this week, we begin to notice that détournement and dérive and psychogeography, these strategies sort of over time become less relevant, right? Less useful. And certainly the essay, the interview with Kristen Ross and Henri Lefebvre is fascinating, to say the least, because first of all, it's gossip of the highest order. It's a wonderful insight into what was going on between the SI and Lefebvre, but someone that was that close for that long, and even after they had their big breakup, still was within that orbit, right? Because he was interacting with other thinkers and theorists that happened to be, sociologists and philosophers. But yeah, it does have an air of gossip. It sounds like something Proust would have written, only because it does give us insights into both Lefebvre's, a certain degree of bitterness, as to how this thing sort of eventually played out, and the yelling back and forth and the accusations of plagiarism and so on. Yeah, it's not something it's kind of airing your dirty laundry, but it's a fascinating read, because it gives us some insights into what was going on. And certainly here, I've got the book in front of me. Now, that essay is also reproduced in this book here, Guy Debord, Situationist Texts. Now, half of this book are essays by the SI. Many of those are in the Ken Knabb book, which you have access to as a PDF. So you're not really missing much. And I've also found a couple more essays written about the SI, but not by SI members. And they also appear in this book here. But this essay, again, keep calling it an essay, this interview between Lefebvre and Kristen Ross, I think is very useful, because it gives us a sense of just how things developed at a very early point. And there is, for example, the Cobra group that is also someone that I'll talk about in some of the later videos. And they were, again, sort of architects and sociologists and thinkers, again, trying to come up with these new ideas. And again, this time, like, they were going to push that envelope and didn't want to be considered as, parodying or parroting, earlier ideas, because the very ideas that were in the air at the time, this kind of, the urban blight and functionalist buildings that Le Corbusier was building, that essentially ended up being the problem. If things are built so they can be functionalist, the end result is they're kind of ugly, right? Ivan Chechlog had pointed out to us a couple of weeks ago, they look like prisons. And then Constant doesn't use the prison metaphor, but he talks about these concrete cemeteries, which is a really powerful image. But that is kind of the way they're looking at it. These look like these just big concrete buildings. So what I want to do is just to start by just going a little bit through the essay and pointing out some of the ideas that I thought were really important. First of all, is the fact that the SI was not this unique, utterly individual group that sort of spun in an orbit of its own. It clearly interacted with what had come before, whether it was Hegelian Marxist thought, the thought of Lukács, but also Lefebvre, who's writing literally at the same time. So he had been writing for roughly 10 years prior, and many of the ideas that he had presented really became the foundation for some of the SI's sort of urban theories, and kind of underlying virtually all of the themes that we will sort of experience as we read through. It is a desire to sort of reformulate this urban blight that Paris was becoming. These heavy, ugly-looking concrete functionalist buildings that just had just no style, no charm, no soul. And in viewing Paris as it was constantly being rebuilt, again, these sort of expedient lines where we have, better flow of traffic, better flow of goods, maybe less flow of humans, and that in itself becomes a problem. Lefebvre is writing about all of these things. So he does say there was a constant, the Provost group, and the other, so along with the urban and sociological issues, the other really important issue too is this marks the end of Stalinism. So you have an awareness that the world is changing, not in a way that they're very pleased with, because it's kind of starting to look ugly. But as this is happening, as you could say, as one view of the world is kind of congealing, another one is sort of breaking apart. And what's breaking apart at this point in the 50s is the end of Stalinism, right? The end of sort of ultra-Orthodox Marxism. So there is this unique opportunity to begin thinking outside the box again, for lack of a better metaphor. But certainly Lefebvre talks about the end of Stalinism around, say, 1956, which is literally the year before the SI begins. It was entirely the work of one who succeeded Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, who demolished the figure of this predecessor. We have to keep the periodization in mind. And the communist movement was the revolutionary movement at the time. So for anyone thinking of revolutionary events, that was kind of the model to follow. And this model was, in a sense, beginning to fall apart. And there were movements afoot around the world, whether they were attaching themselves to colonial oppression, or in the case of Cuba, against imperialism. Different versions of Marxism and different versions of revolution began to sort of creep up around the world, and which is why the very next page in this interview, Lefebvre talks about Fidel Castro, who succeeded in a revolutionary victory completely outside of the communist movement and the workers' movement. This was an event. And I remember that in 1957, I published a kind of manifesto, Le Romantisme Révolutionnaire, the Romantic Revolutionary, in which I linked the Castro story into all the movements, happenings a little bit everywhere, but that were outside of the party. So we have this sort of beginning of revolutionary thought, but specific to that area. So there is a movement away from dogma and orthodoxy, and a rethinking of what Marxism might look like in Cuba, might look like in Venezuela years later, or elsewhere around the world, in the Congo. Marxism was being discussed, but it was beginning to look different each time we encountered it in either developing nations or colonized countries that were now seeking to overthrow imperialism and colonizing forces. And Lefebvre looks at this as the beginning of a different way to think. Again, that's part of the context in which the SI come into being. Now, one of the things that is really odd, I've got a stack of books here. I want to make sure. Now, Lefebvre talks about this little book right here. I don't know if you can see it, which translates to Vers un romantisme révolutionnaire, towards a romantic revolutionism. And so it's unfortunately never been translated into English. It's just a little tiny book that's about 70 pages. But Lefebvre talks about these kinds of, I guess we could call them romantic heroes, that were taking Marxism and developing it in very specific ways to work in specific places. And Lefebvre thought this was certainly one of the the ways out, right? This Northwest Passage that everyone was looking out of. And at times it was a Northwest Passage out of Marxist orthodoxy. Other times it was a Northwest Passage out of, capitalism and the capitalist society in which many people were living in. So each time it was trying to find a way out or a way through something. And so Lefebvre saw that events such as the Cuban Revolution and its success as one way around it, that individuals could take it upon themselves to begin thinking in unique and original ways. So this again, like I say, I bring this up because it is the context in which the SI is thinking, the thinking in terms of individual strategies. And at this early point, trying not to be dogmatic. Eventually what happens is I think there's a line in here, Lefebvre said they are being dogmatic, but not having any dogma to profess. So it's this strange sort of ambivalent relationship between being really hardcore, very pure, and yet at the same time, not having specific dogma that they're trying to export out to people. Because Debord himself eventually said, look, we're not the new model. We're simply going to disseminate information. So that there was some confusion, we'll say, over the way that the SI saw itself and the way that others that were closely associated with it saw the way in which they were working. There is a belief that over time, the SI became more dogmatic, but didn't have the actual 10 commandments of what we needed to do. They wanted those to be flexible, but were really hardcore about people following them. So it is a bit of a paradox. So there is important information here too in Lefebvre's interview, where we start talking about the way in which France viewed the events in Algeria, because Algeria is also the background for the development of the SI's political theories regarding colonial powers. And he mentions too that an opposition group within the party and also the movement outside the party, they were the only ones who supported the Algerians. Now we see very early in the SI's writings support for the Algerian cause. And this is something that becomes of great importance to the SI, simply because it becomes a chance to export a model that they want to see whether it's going to work. Now, we don't have any records anywhere that the Algerians knew of the SI or followed the SI. We don't know for sure, but certainly from the French position, at least seeking to help, seeking to export ideas, that was their intent. How successful it was, it's hard to tell, because like I say, there's no clear documentation from the Algerian side that they in fact were paying attention, that knew about the SI. But certainly the fact that they even paid attention to it is something that's remarkable, because Lefebvre talks about how the French Communist Party really didn't want to get involved with them at all, because it had its own issues. It had its own sort of questions regarding dogma, orthodoxy, Stalinism. But those, some within the party, but mostly outside the party, but still considering themselves Marxists, were looking to see if they could do something to help. So that is, again, another sort of background. Lefebvre then turns around. I mean, this is where the gossip part is great. He talks about some of the other groups that were less than successful in creating an alternative. And here he talks about Isidore Issou and the Letterists. They also had ambitions on an international scale, but it was all a joke. And I don't know, I think is it the second video I made? There's some stuff on the Letterists, and we see their work, and it's interesting, sure. But will it change the world? Probably not. Will it ask us to sort of reformulate ideas about poetry? Possibly. So when we look at what things like the Letterists were doing, first of all, and then the Letterists International were also doing, we can see that there are some serious sort of limitations as to what groups like that can do, as opposed to a more stridently political version of the Letterists, which became, of course, the Situationist International. So that lineage is there for sure, and it is an important one. But even as late as the mid-50s, as the SI were about to come into being, that there were clear understandings that the letterists themselves and the Letterists International had severe limitations as to what they could possibly do, especially in terms of a sort of unitary urbanism, which is what they end up being much more concerned with. Now, there's also a mention about Lefebvre's idea of moments that are like situations, but more so. And then again, here's Lefebvre laying down the groundwork for ideas that can be actually enacted upon in the real world. He calls them one thing, the situations call them something else, but certainly there is a relationship between these two particular thoughts. So then he goes on to describe sort of how these various sort of dérives would be happening. And again, for I guess a working definition, dérive is simply sort of that kind of conscious drifting, right? It's conscious drifting through cities, often at night, often with walkie-talkies, and usually would take place either over a weekend, so usually a short period of time, or maybe overnight, and just intentionally exploring and staying in touch with one another. Hey, what have you found? What have you found? And of course, some of the stranger ones, the ones where I say sort of bordering on bonkers, is they often would take a map from another city and imagine they were walking through Paris when in fact they're looking at a map of Berlin. And so, I mean, kind of fun, but I kind of makes you wonder, like, okay, this is only for the next 8 hours. So the worst I can do is walk 5 miles, right? So some things that, yes, Judith.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to get back to the short paper and find out if we had a specific week that it was due, because I'm hoping that I can submit it after comps.
Okay, you know what? In your particular case, that would be what, maybe week 6 or week 7?
The week, the first week of March.
Okay, so I'm just going to click on my little calendar here. So we're looking at week 3. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Oh, that's 8. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now, yeah. Oh, okay. Now, because I want to be able to accommodate you as much as possible in terms of that schedule. Now, you're the only one that's doing comps that is in this group. Is that correct?
Yes.
From what I know. Okay. Now, what we can do, I mean, if everyone is okay, because I mean, I would still like to be able to mark it. Would anyone have a problem if Judith hands hers in a little bit later and is maybe going to present a little bit later? Because again, this is our group.
Anyone? We've got a problem.
Going once, going twice. Okay, so so Judith, officially, here we are. We have more than a quorum. We've had some. There we are, a couple thumbs up. Okay, so why don't you hand it in once you've done the comps? Because I dream about that blackboard. It haunts me. I can just imagine what you're going through right now. So how about you hand yours in when you're able to, once you've done the comps. The rest of you, I will give you some flexibility. I can move it even to week 6. I don't know how heavy of a workload you have. For example, just by show of hands, are any of you teaching a course right now, like working as TAs? So 1, 2, okay, 3, 4, okay, 5. Okay, so 5 of you right off the bat are working as TAs, and you probably are going to be around weeks 5 or 6, probably reading a lot of essays, I would think, depending on the course. Would it benefit anyone or any of you if I moved it, say, to week 6? You could hand in your assignment at week 6, because what's kind of nice with the group being this small, I think we will still have time, because it's a 12-week course. I think we'll have time for everyone to be able to present their material. Yes, good luck, definitely, to sort of present your work, and then still have time to be able to segue that into the research project. So would it benefit anyone for me to move the deadline to week 6?
And that's reading week, I think, right?
Yes, because your reading week is different from the one at Fanshawe. Yours is still in February. Is that correct? It could be week 6.
Yeah.
Would you like to use that reading week to work on that at least? And then, because you may have some papers to mark as well, but again, this thing does not need to be a fully formed paper. It can be still fairly, informal. in kind of point form, but certainly even if you present the form, the points, you'll be able to get a general idea of, what that shape of it is going to be like. So just again, I'm going to click on my calendar here. So week 3, 4. Now, reading week is the week of Family Day on the 15th.
Yeah.
Okay, so why do we have it? And I'm going to put the date on when we're finished. Why do we make the due date, the submission date for this short draft, February 21st? Does that sound reasonable? Cool. It's so easy to talk like this. International language. Okay, your birthday, sweet. Okay, I just had mine, so I'm good. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We'll have it moved to the 21st, and we'll still keep doing the classes in the same way. And we can still talk about things, and you will at least have a chance to formulate some fairly good ideas by let's say I'm week 5 or 6, and sort of shaping this thing into something that's informal but presentable. Shouldn't be hopefully too much of a problem. But yeah, let's make it February 21st. And then after that, I think we'll have enough time for everyone to do a proper presentation, and we'll go from there. Now, so Judith, in the meantime, as I said, if that still is right in the middle of your comps, don't worry about it. Hand it in after the fact, because I do not want to stress people out. That's not my job. I tell students, again, also the other school, it's like, I'm going to do everything I can to help, but even though I do, there's other people waiting to just inflict all kinds of pain on you. And that's not the way school should be. Okay, so at least for the short paper, February 21st, which is the Sunday following the reading week, Slack week, whatever. I don't think too many people are going to be traveling this year. At least you shouldn't. So we'll do it that way. And then Judith, when you're done, your comps, then you hand yours in as well. And the Dropbox will remain open, and we're good that way. Okay, so we've got that out of the way. And I just wanted to just kind of carry on with some of the things in here in Lefebvre's, as these, again, keep calling it an essay, interview. One thing that he does mention, and again, this kind of the gossip part, is we get kind of some insight into Guy Debord as a person. And Lefebvre at one point talks about the fact that Debord's character was, he's very, I mean, obviously very well versed and conversational and so on, but there's this part of him, and Lefebvre writes, I knew Guy Debord's character and his manner and the way he had of imitating André Breton by expelling everyone in order to get at a pure and hard little core. In the end, the members of the Situationists were Debord, Raoul Vanigam, and Michel Bernstein, who at that time was his, I believe, his wife. And eventually, they just got pushed out more and more. And he said, this expulsion for reasons of disastrous influence, it's rubbish. It was really about keeping oneself in a pure state, like a crystal. Debord's dogmatism was exactly like Breton's. And what's more, it was a dogmatism without a dogma. So yeah, there was Maxwell.
Yeah, I just had a question about how consistent, I guess we could say, that reading of Debord is, because it's definitely the impression that I've gotten through the readings. But it's interesting to me if Debord is kind of carrying over the Breton domination of that group. It really changes the way that I can read the essays and intentions. So when Lefebvre says that he's behaving in that way, is that like a standard reading of Debord at the time?
I think until Lefebvre points it out, the belief was that the surrealists and the situationists were quite different. But what Lefebvre was pointing out, and because this came out in the early 80s, it did cause sort of a rethinking of exactly why the group seemed to become smaller and smaller and sort of pure and pure in its, again, it's kind of non-dogmatic dogmatism, because it became much more political. Certainly with events occurring in the mid-60s to the late 60s, it became increasingly political. And Debord had to be careful to make sure that he maintained that very, increasingly clear Hegelian Marxist line when it came to their politics. But oddly enough, Breton had done the very same thing. He turfed out people regularly in very much the same way. And so I think until people had an inside glimpse of what the SI was about, its sort of inner dynamics, and Lefebvre certainly would have been able to do that. Most of us didn't know that this was what he was trying to do, that he was a very dominating character. I know from speaking to Ken Nab, and I asked him directly, who actually was the SI, or what was the SI towards the tail end? And he said, essentially him. He functioned, because if you see the journals, International Situationists, volumes 1 to 12, you can see there's an editorial board. And he said, nah, it was just him. So eventually what's happening is he's taken over. He's now the voice of the SI under the guise of a collective. But that collective just got smaller and smaller. And ironically, very much like what Breton had done with the Surrealists, because again, there were political issues where people like Louis Aragon finally left because there was disagreement as to what the Surrealists were about, what they were about politically, socially, artistically. And those disagreements, that tension within the group, it couldn't hold it. And the end result is like, whether it's Breton or Debord, they seem to act the same way. And it's true, if there is a sense of being strident, I think that's kind of what's happening. It's a proper read. I think having that insight, we can see how things just get increasingly not so dialectic, but even more pointed in that very political kind of fashion. Judith.
Was Debord ever directly confronted on the record about his behavior and his attitude? And is there evidence of him justifying himself?
No, actually, ironically, once the SI sort of folded in 1972, he almost went into hiding. Like, there were people who thought he had died. And that was one of the reasons why the SI suddenly expired. But he had already written the book, The Real Split in the SI. It had come out in France in 1972, immediately after the SI had finished. But he literally dropped out of sight. At one point, the belief was that he, lived in Italy. Then he was back in France. He had been in France the whole time. But no, answer to your question, I don't think he apologized. He thought it was necessary. He thought it was necessary to keep that pure core, because what he was fighting against, there were two things. There was the spectacular nature of revolution, not as in it's wonderful, but it's a spectacle. And then he had what he had called the pro situ, which were people who supported the SI, but really had no clue about that theoretical component in their behavior. Because like the way in which he wanted to break down the barrier between the artist and the spectator, he also wanted to break down the barriers between theory and practice. And he found that those that simply embraced a revolution because it looked good, or we can go and break shit, but why? Like, what will be derived of that? Oh, I don't know. So he wasn't apologetic, because I don't think he wanted to deal with the people that, that he thought were, well, for lack of a better description, inferior. So the pro situ, gung-ho for the SI, but really not sure theoretically why they were doing something. And then you have their behavior becoming increasingly spectacularized. They were being sold as a thing. And this is the one thing that Debord did not want to have happen, for them to be presented as, yet another arts group or yet another revolutionary group that can be, in a sense, put on display. And of course, when you live in a spectacular society, the tendency of that to happen is almost 100%. I mean, you can go downtown and buy a Malcolm X T-shirt, a Che Guevara T-shirt, and whatever, a Fidel Castro lunchbox or whatever. And it's, I'm being facetious here, but that's what he was afraid of. So he didn't think he needed to apologize to anyone for the kind of increasingly political, strident language that he was using, because he felt at the time that it was necessary. Now, he also had to be very careful to balance that with the fact that, he also didn't want to get arrested. So that was another reason why he kind of went deep six, because in Western Europe, especially in Germany, but actually Germany and Italy, the the revolutionary groups there were much more dangerous. They were, yes, actually the notboard.org, excellent, excellent place. That actually is run by Ken Knabb. So there's a lot of stuff that he's posted that doesn't appear in the books. Each of the journals have essays that have not been translated, but regardless, that's really sort of a good resource for looking up a lot of this stuff. Anyway, to get back to what I was saying, so on the one hand, you've got the kind of the groupies, or the groupies and rock stars that are surrounding the SI, and De Boer thinks that he is above them. But secondly, he also doesn't want to push this sort of star figure too far, because he knows that the police, especially in Germany and in Italy, because of the increasing militancy of the revolutionary groups, he could have been a target. In fact, friends of his were targets. He had a friend that was murdered, who was associated with an Italian group, murdered in France, and the murder was never solved. So he knew that it was to his benefit to kind of lay low, and he actually moved to a small little suburb outside of Paris, and essentially lived there with his second wife for the rest of his life till 1994. So yes, he didn't apologize, because partly he didn't think he had to, and partly because he thought that the people that he offended needed to be offended in a sense, because again, he didn't think too highly of the prostitutes. So whenever you see that name, that's essentially what it means. It's a group of, it could have been students, they could have been, workers, proletariats, who knew of the SI, but didn't fully understand the theoretical angle, or that theoretical component, and the fact that theory and practice needed to be combined together. There had to be a reason why you were doing something. And even if you're out on the street doing something strange, you're taking time off from work, if you're even working, you're making a statement, you're stopping traffic, whatever it may be. Helen.
Yeah, in the thesis on traffic and the theory of unitary urbanism, which I think we read for this week,
Yep.
Like when they're talking about changing urban design to increase possibilities for play and like more direct relations between people, I was just wondering, is the way they're using play like very precise, or is it supposed to be kind of malleable and imprecise and open? Because I was a little confused by how they're using play. I mean, we can all guess how they're using it, but I was just curious. Yeah.
Now, was that in the essay on traffic, or the other one by Constant, Another City for Another Life?
I think both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because one thing that they are doing is certainly the view of play, it for sure is there. And play is this push against reification. The other one, the Kristen Ross book here, Emergence of Social Space, this one here. Now, you probably noticed I posted two different versions of this. One is an actual ebook, which is probably a lot easier to read. That's the one that I received when I ordered this book. So I wanted to post it for you to have a look at. But Kristen Ross talks about this notion of play, and she talks about how Rimbaud is kind of the sort of proto-poet that presents this idea of je et un autre, I am another. But in French, there's something really cool about the word je, which is play, and je, which is I, and that kind of slippage. Now, I don't know who said that. I remember either reading it somewhere, it could have been Kristeva, it could have been somebody, I don't know, but I remember reading that, and at the time hadn't read Rimbaud, and then all of a sudden, there it is, right? Je et un autre, I am another. And so the kind of playing and slippage between sort of the reified role that we have as individuals, because again, Kristen Ross talks about that in her introduction, this notion of un travailleur, right? A worker versus a métier, which is a career, and how stringent the French looked at that. Like, you're a factory worker, how dare you be a poet, right? And then here's Rimbaud, who's everything. He's just a young kid, he's a poet, a revolutionary. In a later life, he started businesses. He was running arms. He was an arms dealer at one point. So talk about in all senses, like he's one of these really interesting characters. But to get back to your point, the notion of play is very important here, because it does hark back to what Rimbaud had originally envisioned as this kind of playful version of ourselves. But certainly in the confines of the late 50s, when the SI are actively, thinking through this, there is this notion of reification in terms of the behaviors of people, both socially and economically. The notion of this, worker versus career becomes even stronger, and people, need to be in their places. So to play with that, to push the boundaries of that was one of the ways in which they found it, even on a lower scale, the way in which you could push that and say, look, I'm not just a factory worker. I am also a poet, or an artist or whatever. So these were the kinds of things that they could embrace on a lower level without overturning society completely, but at least breaking out of this otherwise rigid, reified view that society had of people because they were just factory workers, as opposed to being a professional poet or professional writer. So that was kind of, that's where the play is coming from, where that slippage is coming from. Now, just for the record, I mean, I worked in a factory for 35 years. So I don't know if that changes your opinion of me in any way, but yeah, but I kept on going to school. I just didn't know better. And I'm here now. Why? Because Kellogg's closed. It closed the doors on me. And so they said, see ya, bye. It was the best thing that could have happened to me. But I kept on going to school. Don't recommend it. Because I was working full-time and going to school in Toronto at York, and I somehow did it. Someone that maybe looks like me did it. I don't know, but I did. But that's when I read that, I went, yeah, I get it. And so that's kind of what happens. People form opinions of people based on where they work. Like the very derogatory, he's just a Walmart greeter. That's the same kind of thing. But it really meant something in France at that time. So to break out of that and play with that identification, that social identification, was just one subtle, small way they could push back on that reified view of individuals. Maxwell, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just wondering if, or what the likelihood of them playing off of Kant would be in this case. I'm not super clear on how philosophically read the group is as a whole. De Boer definitely reads as somebody like akin with the people I'm more used to in Dada and Surrealism, who I can definitely point at and say like they know this certain tradition. But when I hear play, my mind always goes to the free play of faculties. So I'm just wondering if that is an influence here, or if they're using it in more of like a colloquial sense.
I would say probably a more colloquial sense, because I don't remember seeing Kant ever mentioned in any of the writings. Certainly not the ones in Nab's book. There might be some untranslated stuff that might show up, but I'm going to hazard a guess that certainly one of Kant's ideas is this notion of duty, right? When we talk about like his moral philosophy, we have a duty to do the same thing all the time, regardless. The very idea of following dictates and following laws, because this is the social mores of that time. This would be something that they probably would not embrace now, but the free play of the faculties, certainly that would be part of it. And whether or not they identified it as being particularly Kantian, I don't know, like I say, because I don't remember, I don't think I see Kant's name mentioned anywhere. Lots of Marx, lots of Hegel, Lukács, but Kant is just not someone that they really encountered or tangled with in any kind of way, even dismissively. It is a bit of a lack, because certainly when you read Hegel and Marx, Kant is never far behind. I mean, he sets all the problematics, right? Which of course Hegel goes and corrects. I would say probably the other thing they wouldn't agree with is Kant's view of the dialectic, right? That it is, now I always get it confused, the logic of illusion or the illusion of logic. But I think it's the logic of illusion. It's the one I think is right, and it's actually wrong. So the logic of illusion, that things seem to make sense. And Kant in Critique of Pure Reason warns us against using the dialectic haphazardly. And I don't think that's something that the SI would have embraced. They would have said, no, the dialectics is pretty sound. Parashini.
So since he brought up philosophy, what really struck me, I mean, throughout all of these readings and the video documentary, is that first of all, I think their not maybe borrowing from, but they're dealing with a lot of problems in the way that the Frankfurt School was, which is that they're dealing with culture, questions of culture, art, etc. But also, I mean, a lot of their ideas clearly are going to lead to post-structuralism in many ways, which is why it's very intriguing how they've retained aspects that are both here and there. So there are two specific questions that I had. One was you mentioned the superstructure and base in the video. My question was, they obviously are more concerned with the superstructure, but do they hope that in changing the superstructure that the base is going to change as well? Or do they just hope that modern life, with all of its complexity and everything, we can adapt to it in a healthier way, which is not alienated, etc. And I'm guessing that might have changed over time, because towards the end, when they realized that some of their practices did not turn out so fruitfully, that economism, is perhaps more important than they had presumed. And the second question is about this. I mean, I constantly get the sense that there is this essential being that they're constantly referring to, and they really hope that behind this world of appearances and everything, that there is an essential creative self that's there, out there, everywhere, and that this particular person already has those ideas that they believe their work can sort of tease out. But how is it that, I mean, they can even retain this sort of essentialism? I mean, it's a little hard for me to imagine that that this is possible, theoretically speaking. And is it, I mean, could it be the European subject or whatever? Or what exactly is this? I mean, how do you deal with it theoretically?
Okay.
So these
now,
two questions. Sorry.
okay. Judith, I'm going to let you respond, and then Maxwell, and then maybe we can kind of get something going, because you've unpacked a lot of ideas that I want to have a look at. So Judith, I wanted to allow you to add to what Payushini said, and then Maxwell, and then we'll go from there.
Great, thanks. Yeah, just on that second point that you raised about the subject, I think that's just like such a fruitful area to get into, because that was where I really paused when I was reading Eagleton's intro to the Kristen Ross book, when Eagleton is identifying the problem of the revolutionary subject in Marx. And Eagleton is kind of asking the same question you're asking, which is, who is this subject? Who is the subject who will adopt and incorporate these revolutionary attitudes into their way of being? And what kinds of like pre-existing mental structures does this subject have? I feel like, picking up, I think, on like an implication of what you said, there are just so many assumptions and presumptions in the SI's writing and in their work and in DeBoer's work about who the revolutionary subject will be. And will it be another white, white middle-aged man who is able to like incorporate revolutionary ideas and then act in a very particular way? But I like how Eagleton said that, like, I can't remember exactly, but I really liked his point about like the presuppositions that we're making about the subject and who the revolutionary subject is and how it's problematic.
Yeah, it's a matter of fact, in the forward here, I'm just looking at it, and I underlined it, because as soon as he came up with a second class subject, he went, okay, let's reread this. So he says there's actually three different types, right? He calls one the pure class subject, which I think is the one that Marx refers to, because Marx is known for never identifying specifically individuals. To be a feminist and a Marxist would be rather difficult, because it's kind of hard to know exactly what he's talking about. So you've got the pure class subject, the idealized class subject, and then the revolutionary subject. And even there, he talks about the subject in process of the early tel quel, fragmented into ecstatic non-identity by revolutionary desire. And you just, this exploding mass of orgasms, is just going, yay, revolution. And it's like, what? But you're right. It's that's why I wanted you to have a look at this forward, because it is really rich with possibilities. So Payushini, I hope that helps a little bit. And in kind of the assumptions, Judith, that you made, and they are clearly there. because there is, on the one hand, this possibility that individuals have this, like, we're hardwired to be creative. Now, this is something that is Marxist, because he did believe, like, that romantic strain in his writings, where he says, yeah, we had this ability to push back, and we can be creative, but at the same time, we seem to exist abstractly, other than economic and philosophical manuscripts, where we're both an abstract being and a stomach, which is one of my favorite lines out of there. We are actual people. He kind of loses sight of that actual living person. And I think the SI are trying to sort of bring that character back. Now, whether they are a revolutionary subject that is ecstatic and non-identity, maybe some version of that might be what they were after. But again, those assumptions are certainly there, that we can tap into it. It is something that we're hardwired to do, to be creative. But we'll keep unpacking this. So Maxwell, you wanted to add something as well.
Yeah, I did. I'm not going to answer the question at hand, but probably just complicate it for my own pleasure. But also, before asking that, I was wondering if you could remind me what page the three subjects are on, because I can't find it in my own notes.
So if you go again, this is the book, but on page, the forward page 7, in the second paragraph that starts, not all the time, of course, revolutions by definition are made not by the cadres, but by the masses. So about 3 sentences in, he talks about nobody is greatly enamored these days by the notion of a pure class subject, whole and affirmative in its unitary identity. And then he goes on a few sentences later, the idealized class subject would always seem to know already exactly what is needed to be intuitively present to itself in its demands and desires. And then finally, at the top of page 9, then he says, perhaps in the revolutionary subject we are searching for is the delirious subject in process of the early tel quel, which would be, Kristiva's revolution in poetic language. That's the character. So we're kind of having to consider just what this revolutionary subject is comprised of. What is it composed of? Now, even in the middle of page 8, he also says, if the untainted class subject is to be rejected, then it should perhaps be with a modicum of caution. The alternative revolutionary paradigm to which we can then turn would be that of a fractured, libidinal, disordered subject. Now we're talking about Lacan and psychoanalysis. So we've got different revolutionary subjects and assumptions made by the SI as to which one they are talking about. And yes, they are certainly guilty of talking about the masses at times. They can talk about sort of individual strategies that may be artistic, but I don't think there's a clear definition, Judith. I think you're right. There isn't a clear definition of who the revolutionary subject is, when Eagleton clearly points out there are different versions of that, and there are different ways to look at that whole revolutionary process. Which one are we actually talking about? Peter, you wanted to add to that?
I actually wanted to say, once we're done with the discussion of like revolutionary subject, I had a question not related to that.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. That's not a problem. So, Maxwell, you're going to be dialectical on us?
I just wanted to throw in my complication,
sure,
which is actually pointed at Peter, so that worked out well, hopefully. The question about the subject made me wonder if, and the essentialism of the SI, it makes me wonder if the SI are post-humanist. And I want to throw that question at Peter, because I feel like you're going to run with it a little bit.
Peter, it's your call, and Payashini, we were going to go back to culture after this.
Well, I mean, I'm inclined to say no. But I mean, this kind of gets at like an issue that I've. Okay, so I'm not really going to answer the question exactly. I'm going to kind of skirt around it. Like, one of the issues I've had while reading them is like, are they anti-work or post-work? And I think that's an important distinction to make, because like the way I think of anti-work is Debord spray painting like Ne travaille jamais on a wall.
Yeah.
And like he's still living in a society that works, but he's just like, you know what, I'm too cool for this, fuck that, I'm gonna spray paint a wall. whereas post work seems to be like the positive embrasure of automation that we get kind of like hinted at in Lefebvre and hinted at, I think it's in one of the Constant pieces, that is like, we overcome this need to work. And I think if they're the latter, they could be read in like some quasi-post-humanist light, but I'm not getting that vibe from Debord at all. I'm getting this like kind of edgy, like I just don't want to do this. And this may just be my own negative feelings toward Debord, but like, I don't know, it just it seems like they're more anti-work as opposed to post-work, and the latter seems to be more in line with some post-humanist line of thinking, but it would be more troubling. You'd have to problematize it more than that.
I just want to add to that. There are both of those positions you could take. I don't think the SI took their embracing of automation as far as they could have, because they did do that. And I think that position would perhaps place them more in the notion of post-work, in the sense that they knew obviously that, you know, somebody had to pick up the garbage at some point, as much as, you know, it's not a fantastic job, but it's something you need to do. They were willing to work as a means to an end. And I think if they picked up jobs here and there, I think in the Lefebvre interview, the question is like, how do these people survive? Because I don't know. You know, they picked up a lot of jobs here and there to keep themselves alive, but they viewed work as a means to an end. So they would fall under the category of travailleur, right? They were simply worker. They would do whatever they needed to stay alive. But the notion of automation and viewing it as creating a post-work world, that's what they were trying to embrace. And this book here, I don't know if you know this one, Demand for Automation, right? Demand of the Future. The discussion I think that happens here, full automation, the first demand is a fully automated economy using the latest technological developments. Such an economy would aim to liberate humanity from the drudgery of work while simultaneously producing increasing amounts of wealth, we hope. What the SI wanted to do was to embrace technology and automation to the degree that it would remove all this drudgery. And if people wish to work after the fact, clearly the nature of the work would be very different. But it just seemed like the number of factories that were going up in and around Paris must have been pretty depressing. And the notion of, you know, if we have automation, let's do it, but we need to have something that's going to help in lieu of losing one's job. You know, embrace options, embrace alternatives, embrace other ways of living. And I think that part of it was either assumed on behalf of us, you know, reading the material, or something that simply was not sort of brought to fruition in the time that they were writing. Because I mean, their idea of automation wasn't even computerized stuff. And we're facing a serious problem, 50 million jobs over the next decade that will now become fully automated. That's pretty dangerous. So the part that, I mean, they never talk about a universal basic income, for example, which is something that Nick Cernick talks about in this book as an alternative, right? That is going to at least provide some money for people. But this idea of breaking away from, you know, simply being a travailleur because you have to, if you do, it's because it's a means to an end. So I would sort of lean towards the post-work. What that post-work world looks like was maybe not as well defined as it should have been. Judith.
Yeah, this is another thought about the subject, but it is linked to these issues that you're discussing about the orientation of the SI towards work. Mm-hmm. So again, in Terry Eagleton's foreword, like we already discussed, he's outlining the problematic of the subject and who the revolutionary subject is. And I think in those forms of the subject that he mentions, there's the pure class subject, and then, you know, maybe instead we need the idealized class subject. No, maybe instead we need the revolutionary subject. Oh, wait, the revolutionary subject's ideas are exploded in their head, and they're not, as he describes, like they're not even centered enough to be able to actualize.
It's a beautiful image of just exploding vocabularies of going in it's taken this dans tous les sens that Rimbaud talks about in all directions. Yeah. Not, I mean, it's like somebody that can't focus on one thing is kind of what he's implying.
Yeah, and so it seems like it can't be that person. That person can't carry out the revolution. But then
Yeah.
later, Eagleton also brings up the question of the maturity of the subject, and like he kind of dwells on this, the binary of maturity, immaturity, and maybe when we look at Rimbaud, we can learn better who the revolutionary subject is, but at the same time, there is a certain immaturity in, I think like both he's saying an immaturity in the youth revolution
Yeah.
that was the Paris Commune, but also Rimbaud is sort of an immature subject. And when I think of the video and the way the video outlined Rimbaud, like Peter was reminding us of like the spray painting on the wall, Rimbaud was just anti-work. Like he's not post-work. There's no theorizing of that. Instead, it's like, F you. If I ever pick up a hammer, you know, it'll be the end. I'm using this pen, and that is it. That's the be all and end all. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight, like, I think there's it's different ways of considering who the revolutionary subject is. And this immature subject, I think, is a really insufficient place to stop. And I don't think that that is the subject who can actualize any change. But then it is important to consider those other facets of the subject that Eagleton is describing, which are more epistemological. What does the subject know or have to know in order to act, which is separate from, is the subject mature enough to act?
Yeah.
I think we see a lot of immaturity in this like anti-work stance, and in these types of subjects who, I don't know what they know or don't know, but if all they end up like emotionally acting out is screw work, then like that's not going to be enough for the revolution. And it wasn't enough for the revolution.
Yeah. Now, the other aspect in Eagleton's intro is in the forward is association with youth and spontaneity, and that somehow being a degree of immaturity, which ends up being what the SI liked about the Paris Commune. As much as it was a failure historically, there was a degree of spontaneity and youthful energy that allowed this thing at least to exist for a couple of months. And now, once that happens, what do? Can you maintain that spontaneity to the point where you suffer a heart attack because you can't maintain it? It is an odd balance simply between the notion of being youthful, spontaneous, and being able to construct something quickly. And that certainly is more about energy than it is about intellect. But at some point, you have to have the intellect to recognize what you have. And I'm sure that the Paris Commune understood what they had, understood that it was a kind of festival. The passage that Lefebvre talks about sounded more like a carnival, like what Bakhtin's carnival would have been like. Within a confined space, the world is turned upside down. The army shows up, and they're not berated and pelted with rocks. They're kissed and hugged, and hey, have some food. Quite the opposite. And Paishini, you talked about last week how the farmers greeted the police in just exactly the same way. So it was almost like a world turned upside down temporarily. But at some point, a degree of intellect or maturity needs to sort of settle in, like, okay, what is this new world going to look like, and how can we maintain it? Because youthful spontaneity is one thing, but maintaining something, that's where that intellect and that maturity, I think, needs to kind of come to the surface and say, well, we've structured this new thing, how can we make it last? But certainly with Rimbaud, you're absolutely right, because on the same page where he says, did he perhaps have secrets that would remake life, which is kind of the whole sense of this week's conversation. On the same page, he screams, I'll get down on all fours and writhe on the carpet. I want my wealth stained all over with blood. I will never do any work, and never in italics. And it's true. And yet he ended up as an arms dealer in his 30s. Interesting character, like that's Rimbaud. And he never wrote another poem. When he finished, I don't know if he became disillusioned, but I think he said what he had to say. And he didn't, not that he wanted to die young. I don't think that was his intention. He died, not that much longer, but he had a very rich and fulfilling life, traveled to the Far East, traveled to Africa, like I said, arms dealer. And he was, very much a cosmopolitan kind of person, but did work. I mean, he did work. It's just really odd how he turned out, given the kind of youthful, explosive energy of words. And, in all senses, in all directions. So he is really an interesting character when we talk about immaturity versus maturity. He certainly settled down, and he certainly became a maybe not a respected member of the society, but certainly a functioning one that that held a job and provided some sort of help. But at this early point, 17, 18 years old, and believed to have actually been part of the Paris Commune. Luckily, left before all the massacres, but he was there, and those. Oh, perfect. Okay, arms dealers. Well, we'll talk about the poverty of student life a little bit later, but yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, look at me, factory worker, radio DJ, and now philosopher. So, we wear different hats. We wear different hats. That's what we have to do. So, I want to get back to the idea of culture here because, yeah, Maxwell.
Sorry, this is kind of a half-baked idea, but I was just looking back on Ross's introduction when she's talking about Rancière. I found it really interesting that she attached ideas of emancipation with the ideas of the swarm and atomization. I'm reading Piacini's comment about the self-consistent and fractured nature of the subject, and wanted to throw that in there if anyone wants to pick up that broken idea, or we can just let it die and move on.
Was that anything that anyone else had picked up on? I've got the book right here. Do you remember exactly what page it was on?
20.
Okay. So emancipation following from dispensing with all the positivities of workers' community, radicalizing that automation or that atomization instead. Anybody want to add to that? The poet is not at home, is non-social, indifferent to conforming to conventional standards of behavior, and again, right, off madly in 10 different directions. And of course, in the 1950s and 60s, this was a push against reification. Reification was not at that time a similar issue, but certainly what was at issue in French culture was this notion of the worker versus the career. Right? A careerist somehow had more respect in society. And to be honest, we have that even still today. All of us end up having to work a variety of jobs to make ends meet, to continue existing while we finish up school. But that's something we have to do. After that, we hopefully embark on our, on our métier, right, on our career. But at this point, that view of individuals as being, in a sense, what we'll call an hourly worker versus a salaried worker, blue collar versus white collar. I mean, those terms kind of still around, right? They, whether or not we think twice about, judging people, they're kind of in the marketplace of ideas. Whether or not that's essentially who that person is, I would hope that they're not, because it's just a job's a job. Judith.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point to stop on, like to dwell on, just because so much of what the SIs seem to need to talk about is freeing society and freeing themselves from constraints, from conditions that are constraining. So primarily then, it is essential to identify what are the constraints, what is the social conditioning, to use like language that might be more Foucauldian. What is disciplining people into subjugation that they need to be free from? What are the factors of control? And then Deleuze also writes about like societies of control. Yeah, so I like Maxwell. I like what you pulled out there. The emancipation for Rancière takes as its point of departure not workers' solidarity or community, but rather their atomization under capitalism. I think, yeah, it can be argued that is, it's tricky because it might be a self-defeating statement. Like we know from politics today that starting from a point of atomization is really no longer of interest, is no longer serviceable. We talk a lot more now about social movements and like
communities, for example.
Yeah, a sense of emancipation through community, through joining together, through communities of identity in many cases, or across identity. Yeah, so maybe like that sense of atomization might be a bit of a historical relic, like the fixation on the fact that one of the constraints was I become atomized under capitalism. I'm not sure if we're still, like in the theory world thinking, I'm not sure if we're still fixated on atomization in that same way. What do you think?
Well, I'm just going to say very briefly, we can see how ideas like Durkheim's notion of social enemy, it begins is sort of it's the seed there that this notion of being, sort of atomized or enemy, really a distinct separation from one's community when you are foisted, an identity upon yourself simply because of where you work, or the case of student, right? Such as the essay by Kayati on the misery of students, because again, this identifiable group of people, and certainly one of the ways in which we've been able to work together, literally together, is through not atomization, but overcoming that and regrouping as at the very least communities or like-minded individuals. And I think the Fabian here talks about the Paris Commune as being, and also Kristen Ross talks about how different the people were that were all part of this one community called the Paris Commune, right? There were workers, there were women, there were poets, there were writers. And that's kind of one of the things, like an early version of what we now call the community. So it did foster a sense of connectedness, because all of a sudden now there was a common enemy. And it seemed to transcend, economic lines, or lines certainly associated with, worker rather than careerist. Suddenly, we share a common enemy, which is basically the French government at this point, and we can find that common ground. The moment we do that, the possibility of community now is on the horizon, rather than continually being atomized. Maxwell.
So since this has caught on a little bit, the reason why the swarm comment jumped out to me is that cultural theorist Byung-Chul Han has a book called In the Swarm, where he's contesting the idea of the crowd and the mass as an antiquated term, that today, especially within digital culture, we potentially lack the essential quality that runs through a mass that makes it a collective whole, and instead have swarms of atomized individuals that have passing and transitory, very brief outbursts of outrage, rather than a deeper, committed sense of rage, is the distinction that he wants to make, which seems really useful while we're reading stuff in this vein, because when I read the word anatomized here, I get the sense of an individual. But when I read it in more contemporary theory, it's almost 180-degree flip. And this has also been on my mind for the course that I'm teaching, where I just taught Benjamin trying to explain the aura through Heideggerian authenticity. This the distinction that when we read authenticity today, I think we think of individuals in a very a deep sense, in a radically root individual sense. Which I think is going on in the SI, but in just a little bit before that, the authentic individual through Heidegger is not separate from their culture, but is open to it, awake to it. So there's all these weird, slight adjustments to these terms that I think we now use in a different way that we need to be attuned to.
Mm-hmm. I would just to add to that, I would say that certainly in terms of Heidegger's view of connectedness and openness and being, it's not in the SI. I don't know, because whether Heidegger had not been translated at this point, because there's always translation issues with reading texts that were written at a certain time. We don't know, did they know about Heidegger? Did they know about Karl Kosek and other people like that? Because we can, because it's been translated into English. But I don't recall Heidegger dealt with explicitly in their work, but certainly a connectedness to one's social environment is very much there. Whether we can configure it along the lines that are displayed in Heidegger's work, I can't say 100%, but certainly there is this being attuned to your environment, something that was clearly not happening in the 50s at the time the SI was writing. In fact, that atomization and disconnectedness was one of the very problems of a critique of everyday life, right? How to reconnect. When you look around, well, reconnect to what? To concrete? Like there's nothing to look at. So it becomes an issue of like, okay, I want to reconnect, but to what, right? I need to now create something that's going to allow me to say, I belong, right? That this is part of who I am. Judith.
Yeah, just a really quick thought. Like there's probably a good essay in writing about Debord and his own position as this atomized individual in theory who felt like he had to be the unitary axis on which like the SI theory would happen.
Yeah.
And eventually all sense of collective purpose was stripped away. He was alone acting. So it's just interesting to see like what kind of theories or discussions of the individual subject or of atomization would come from a theorist or a group of theorists driven mostly by one individual. Like there's a bit of like the cult of the personality and
very much
get reflected in the theory itself of individuals and acting.
Mm-hmm. And what's really interesting is that in 1967, when Debord had published Society of the Spectacle, Raoul Vanigam, also then still a member of the SI, published Revolutionary of Everyday Life. And that book, by comparison, is much more playful. And if you compare the two of them, written the same year by two individuals belonging to the same group, they are really distinct in their approach, their outlook, their theoretical positioning, we'll say. Now, Debord is offering ideas and Vanigam is offering strategies. And so we have within this one group sort of two different views of how to deal with this, this spectacular society. And certainly Vanigam is the more playful of the two. He's more impish, we'll say, in terms of some of the strategies that he wishes to adopt. But he too is also careful to create a kind of theory behind these particular strategies, saying that, look, you can't just be a nihilistic revolutionary because what's the point, right? You're not going to achieve anything. You're just going to destroy. What we need to do is a kind of beautiful destruction. And this is an idea going back to Bakunin, right? To turn around and saying, look, even there's joy in destruction because you are aiming to rebuild. And that aiming to rebuild is that second part that Vanigam wanted to remind his readers. And yet, and like I say, these two books came out the same year from the same group, but quite different. And by comparison, one clearly is theoretical versus the other one being much more practical and sort of on the street, we'll say. I don't know if anybody wanted to add any more to that. And then if not, we'll move back to Payushini's original comment about culture, because there were a couple of things that we could actually maybe link together in the discussion here. The one passage, I think if it was the one that you were referring to, this is from the 4th SI conference. This would be page 81. And I think if I don't mention it in this movie, I mentioned it a little bit later on. But they say, to the question, why have we promoted such an impassioned regrouping in this cultural sphere whose present reality we reject, right? It's a spectacle, we're rejecting it. The answer is because culture is the center of meaning of a society without meaning. And this empty culture is at the heart of an empty existence. And the reinvention of a project of transforming the world as a whole must also and first of all be posed on this terrain. To give up demanding power and culture would be to leave the power to those who now possess it. And I think that passage really gives us an indication if there was a maxim or some dogmatic position, we'll say, the notion that although culture is empty, at least in French culture, it can still be filled up. So they need to fight the spectacle with another spectacle. They've got to fight images with other images. And so they say, well, it's in the center of meaning in a society without meaning. We can use this vessel called culture and inform it and present new ideas through it. And of course, culture is both philosophy and art and film and literature and so on. And through that, have that trickle down to the base or the substructure. But clearly they saw, much like the Frankfurt School had done also in the 1940s, so roughly 10 years before, this view that the base, attacking the base substructure and, controlling the means of production was not necessarily going to work, because it seemed that every time there was a strategy that, was going to formulate this, it failed. So the decision to look elsewhere and to look to the superstructure now became something that was more fruitful. And certainly the Frankfurt School point the ways towards doing this. Now, the culture industry, rather pessimistic. It just sounds like, hey, it's okay. There's there's nothing we can do. we're stuck in the middle of it. But here, there's a degree of kind of like, it's just this empty vessel, almost unmoored from society, just spitting back images, buy this, buy that. And they say, no, it's meaningful in a society that has presently no meaning. There's our invitation. Let's infuse this culture with things that are meaningful, that people can respond to, whether or not we're hardwired or we have free play of our faculties, but at the very least recognize ourselves in it. And of course, one of the ideas of détournement was exactly that, to try to take an image, which of course was part of pop culture, part of advertising, comic books, whatever, and rewrite them to have them speak the truth. Now, when you're implying that, you're implying that it wasn't speaking the truth before. And this was the first step, to say, well, advertising is lying to us. All it's doing is instilling a desire. You must need this product. You have to have this product, otherwise your life is going to be meaningless. But for them to say culture is the center of meaning in a society without meaning, and it is an empty existence, it's like this vessel can now be filled up with new ideas. And part of our job is to either reformulate what is there, but at the same time introduce new ideas and eventually break that separation between the artist and the spectator. Because ultimately, for them to be successful, the SI to be successful, that breakdown had to be complete, so that living an artistic life was the be all, right? We're not producing products. We're not producing more commodities. This is one of the issues that the SI had with the surrealists. They wanted it both ways. They wanted to be revolutionary, but they also wanted to leave the options open to sell products, whether they're t-shirts, posters, whatever. And the SI going, no, it is an artistic life. So that means that you can reclaim your subjectivity, you can reclaim your position in society, enjoy life on completely different terms. Now, does that mean we become artists? No, I think we end up living an artistic life in the sense that we decide what matters to us. Now, that should sound slightly existentialist, because existentialists were saying essentially the same thing. You decide what is important for you. You decide, what you wish to present to other people, because that will be what essentially others think of you. So however you behave, that's what others will think of you. Paushini, I think you put up your hand just for a moment.
Yeah, so I was wondering if, whether they hope that changes at a cultural level would, like you said, trickle down to the base and transform it in some way, or is it just modern society itself that they believe they could sort of modify to suit the needs of this new revolutionary emancipated subject?
Now, the last paragraph of the same paper here, we are quite aware that the culture to be overthrown will really fall only with the totality of the socioeconomic structures that support it. So I don't know if that's a short answer. They're saying, yeah, ultimately what is causing and creating the spectacle and maintaining it is capitalism. So the sooner we either get beyond capitalism, which again is, that's an open question, because we're living in this behemoth that gobbles up everything, no matter how radical it may be. That's probably the toughest thing that anybody could address now is, can we get to something that is post-capitalist? And certainly there are many people that are thinking this way, but here I think they're making it clear that the system that creates this empty, inert, dead culture of spectacles, it also needs to be changed, because we can work from the top level, but that's really the method, right? The end result, right, or the means, I should say, the end result is the dismantling of this capitalist system that creates anomie, creates spectacle, creates disconnectedness, and creates the métier versus travailleur and the rest of it. The very system that creates these divisions, that's what needs to be overcome. So short answer, I would say that it starts with sort of a reformulation of culture, giving it meaning, and eventually it will trickle down. But certainly in 1960, that was the intention. So 61 years ago, That was what they originally wanted to do. And the conversation now is more about sort of trying to live in a post capital world. I think last week we were talking very briefly about Mark Fisher and capitalist realism really being a difficult book. I mean, difficult, especially given, you know, what happened to the author. And the same day, my friend posted on Facebook, "Hey, I got this book coming in, Mark Fisher, the last series of lectures." So I contacted him and said, "Here's the dilemma we're facing." He goes, "No, you got to read this. He's got some great ideas." One of which was a return to some of the counterculture groups of the 1960s. So, hey, guess what? We're all ahead of the curve, right? We are back to being groovy again. So I found it really interesting that what we're doing right now is now in the air. Others are going back and saying, okay, not pose the question, where did we go off the rails? But where was the last time we really had something rich with possibilities that could be done on a variety of different, avenues, or through a variety of different avenues, culturally, economically, socially? When was the last time that happened? And one of the groups was the SI. So Fisher goes back and revisits them. I'm in the process of reading through these lectures. They're very good. And I really am happy that this is kind of what happened, because Fisher was not a fan of the 60s. He just thought it was just chaotic, right? It didn't really achieve a whole lot. But he at one point must have thought, can we go back and at least look to see if we can learn something? So his tone is much more conciliatory, but certainly we have every right to criticize the SI, point out their limitations, their sort of ill thought out ideas, or at least ideas that became something else, because they were very much sort of operating in the moment, but also historically aware that there were limitations, but certainly hopefully leaving the seeds and the groundwork for future thinkers. I think that's something that they did do, and we should give them the credit. But as I argue in the book, we need to also make sure the SI gives credit to where the people they borrowed from. And that's why I go back and I'd say, the French symbolists, the surrealists, Dada, Lefebvre, those people need to be acknowledged, because that's where so many of these ideas are originally coming from. And even the notion of, to change life, it's an idea that started with Rimbaud in the 1870s, at the time he was writing. So these ideas, as much as they appear, in poetry, become very useful roughly 100 years later to thinkers and philosophers. And Van Eeghem, I think one of the essays I asked you to read, he even says that, we used to look to the 19th century to philosophy, and now we need to look to poetry, because poetry allows us to envision this world. And we talked a moment ago about the Frankfurt School, and Adorno said exactly the same thing. In aesthetic theory, he says that. Judith.
Yeah, just on that point, now I can't remember, but at the beginning of class, someone was talking about play.
Okay.
It was Helen. I couldn't remember exactly what had happened. But like
we've done a lot of talking.
Yeah, raising the question of play and its origins, and I do feel like looking at the artistic movements of the avant-garde, essential for thinking about like what the SI means when they say play. Like I do think, while it might not be totally clearly defined in theory, although I haven't gone digging through the SI to figure out like what if they have a definition, or someone said like play is X. I think it's primarily artistic. And yeah, it has to do with like imaginativeness and defamiliarization with art practices. And that is what was playful. And then it's just cool to follow that train of thought, because later I think you can get to Deleuzian theory and use it to interpret, like in a very theoretical, intellectual sense, to interpret or describe what play ultimately is.
Now, one thing that's the SI thinkers did that was often, playful. If you can think of the very first film that Guy Debord made, Hurlements en faveur de Sade, which translates to, howlings in favor of Sade, actually showed it at Cannes. He managed to sneak into Cannes to show it. 1952, the film is basically just black and white, and not shot in black and white. It is literally black and white. Nothing on the screen, white. Nothing on the screen, white. So here's a film that literally destroys cinema. no images, no actors, there's just voiceover. And there are sections that go for 15 or 20 minutes, nothing, just a black screen. So he goes in and says, okay, I've now just destroyed cinema. The same year, I think Asger Johns published a book, and the cover was made out of sandpaper. So when you file it into your bookcase, you destroy all the books around it. And so it was playful, it was quite humorous, but the theory behind it was what was really interesting. Like, we're out to destroy the past. We're out to, to basically clear the way for new ideas. So if we do it with a sandpaper cover or rethinking cinema, however we do it, there are ways in which we can still create an art piece, and even that eventually became problematic, but create an art piece that contains the theory that we need to rethink virtually everything. And so whether it's a critique of everyday life or a critique of the commodification of art, these ideas started in a very playful sense with just, those two examples. And the sandpaper one, I think is my favorite, because I wouldn't want to own that thing. I'd set it aside somewhere else. But certainly it was the idea that was informing these we'll call them events that allowed them to at least try to think as much as possible, like what are the different strategies. But artistically speaking, I think very much when we look at what was being done, because that wasn't the only film they made. They made several films, Debord in particular, I think made 3 or 4 of them. So the Sade film, the Society of the Spectacle, the film as well. Not that I want to brag. It's an excuse for me to say I plagiarized everything, but I was trying to detool things when I made my videos by simply going to YouTube and nicking whatever was going to work. And as we move further along, you'll see a lot of them is just walking tours of Paris, which are kind of fun because essentially that's what they did. So when I found these things, I'm going, oh, this is just mildly perfect. But it worked because it also was what the essay were all about, just walking and exploring and looking around. Of course, these days, that's pretty difficult to do because, everything's all barricaded and you have to be careful where you are. But certainly at that time, especially when the city was in the process of being transformed. If you go downtown, for example, you see places, that are completely knocked down and it's just a great big pit. So it's kind of cool to look at and go like, wow, nothing lasts forever. Like, think about it. When you look at architecture, you think, okay, that building's going to last forever. You come back a couple of years later, leveled. So it makes you start to think that, you know what, if buildings can come down, ideas can come down, ways of life can come down. And I think, and I have no scientific proof of this, but I would imagine as buildings, right, your literal surroundings are being demolished and rebuilt, it gets you thinking. And again, I use downtown as a good example because it's been being rebuilt over and over again for the last 3 years now almost. And it will look different, but it makes you realize like nothing lasts forever. So to have a disagreement about urbanism and urban renewal and seeing these buildings being demolished, if that concrete thing can come down, so can opinions about it, right? So I think that may have informed their work. Just a thought. Now, I wanted to ask one last thing here because we're already up to 11:30. What were your thoughts on that otherwise depressing piece by Kayati on the poverty of student life? The first half of it probably wasn't a joy to read. I wouldn't imagine. Any thoughts on that essay? I mean, it gets better. It does. It gets better. But the first half is it's pretty bleak because, first of all, at the time it was written in 1966, the idea of the teenager, right, or youth, was basically an invention of capitalism, because the notion of spare time, leisure, extra cash, that's something that is really an invention of the 1950s. And as soon as people have extra cash, well, people want it. So the notion of the youth being a category that it was created by capitalism to, of course, to benefit itself, but the notion of creating a group of people that have surplus wealth, right, to go to the theaters and do things. Now we have the student who's even worse off because, as Kayati points out, they're at the mercy of the two most powerful systems of social authority, the family and the state. Okay, that hasn't changed a lot because we borrow money from our parents and we borrow money in the form of grants. I just wanted your feelings on that. If it was kind of a mirror held up to you that might not have been something you wanted to look into, or I would like to think that some things have changed, because certainly I don't come off looking very better either, or very much as a good person, because the university has become an institutionalized organization of ignorance, right? It's like, wow. But again, the same issue was happening there in student life and in the universities as was happening in society. The rigidity of thought, right? You go to school to become this. You're not going to go to school to think. You're not going to go to school to become an independent individual. You're going to learn your métier, right? You're going to learn your career and become a banker or become an accountant or something else. That was the view of the university at that time. The fact that it was simply a place that will churn out, individuals that would work. So that was the negative view that was informing Coyote's opinion of students. And then, of course, he brings it up and says, okay, they can still be representative as part of that revolutionary culture. Judith.
Yeah, just from the quote you read, I mean, I think that it shows a great distance between the past and the present, because the quote is, the student is directly subjected to the two most powerful systems of social authority, the family and the state. And now you'd probably say like the banks and the internet. So in terms of considering like what systems of social authority are, I actually think that quote reminds me of a simpler time when it was easier to identify like which systems of social authority really were imposing themselves on an individual's life, because now they seem more hidden and concealed, but maybe even like more powerful and complex. Things got more complicated. So I mean, the family and the state are still important, but there's also a bunch of other sinister social forces that are invisible that are acting on a student and a student's life.
Yeah, and of course, what happens is, as you you accrue student debt, that debt now kills off options, right? It kills off possibilities. And I'll be honest, one of the reasons why I ended up in a factory is, I mean, not that I owed a ton of money. Much later, I was able to pay for school as I went along, but owing money when I finished school limited my choices. I couldn't afford to, jump out and try to get into the academia, essentially because I couldn't afford to. I had all this debt to pay. So along comes this job in a factory. I take it. Now I kept on going to school, thankfully, but I think that's what they meant at that point, is that crushing debt, especially American students. It is, I don't even know how you could owe $150,000 or something. I mean, how are you going to pay that off? It's a mortgage. And again, what kind of options have you got? So I think that was really the intent of that statement. It is a social authority, because what it does is it now starts limiting all the potential you will have as a person. Sure, you've got your métier, you've got your career, you know what you want to do, but can you honestly step from school into that right away? Well, now we move from crushing student debt to gig economy, right? And I don't want to have this depress everybody, but yeah, it has changed. It both looks familiar and has become, as Judith has pointed out, much more complex. But I think the same sort of thing is going on, that, the amount of money you owe, depending who it is, really will make you think twice about going, I have to, whatever I find, I have to make enough money to be able to pay some of this off. So it does kind of, you navigate more carefully through it, I think is what I'm trying to say. Maxwell.
In response to Ed, what you're saying and what Judith has offered, I want to suggest that maybe the difference is between authority and attention now, these continuums that we're describing. But actually, I wanted to ask you if you knew if there's a relationship to Edward Said here, because I think around this time he wrote Professionalism and Amateurism, where he describes this movement of the public intellectual out of the institution and into an independent position, publishing with companies outside, specifically in France. I think he's looking at this. So kind of a parallel to discussing student life, I wonder if there's another discussion about the amateur next to the professional development.
I don't know Saeed's text that you're referring to, but certainly this idea of the professional that somehow has to go through school, has to accrue these various degrees and so on. It'd be pretty tough these days to get to that same position without the schooling at the very least, because that's why it's considered professional rather than amateur. Amateur, it could be sports, it could be in the arts. We seem to be more lenient towards somebody that has a natural inclination to do something in an artistic field or literary field. But certainly we seem to draw the line at professionalism that seems to imply, the years in school. Now, does Saeed make the same sort of distinction, or is he implying that we can shift back and forth?
It's been a while since I read it. I think it's been about a year or a little bit more since I read it. But what stood out to me is this movement of passion and authority out of the institution, which it's always been critiqued to be kind of on the outskirts, but this very clear movement of French thinkers in particular shifting out of the institution to publish with companies that were blossoming independently outside to talk about these concerns. So that seems like an interesting parallel contemporary occurrence to me.
Mm-hmm. Now, I would say probably like, Yale University Press, versus a company that I'm with, Lexington Books, which does have lots of theory stuff. But yeah, even taking that road, deciding to publish with either sort of, whether it's a vanity label or whether it's a smaller scale one, because you don't have to sort of be confined, because you're now moving through sort of, a scholastic environment or an academic environment when it comes to publishing. I don't know if that works exactly the same way, but certainly those avenues are there. One thing that did strike me as to what's different in France versus elsewhere is you can graduate from school, you can be a writer, you can do whatever, a theorist, and you can open up a psychiatric practice. You can work as a psychoanalyst. Because Castoriadis did it. Lucie Irigaray also was a psychoanalyst for a period of time. And you don't have to have papers. You can open up your own practice. So that's something I found really surprising, given the history of this, this dichotomy between the worker and the career. The fact that you can start in one field and still work as a psychoanalyst, it's both remarkable and sort of very freeing, so that if that's something you wanted to do, you happen to write about that, you want to go ahead and say, here's what I want to do. But the fact that we have, writers and even Lacan at one point was associated with the surrealists and yet became a psychoanalyst. Okay, there's nothing wrong with that. It can be done. But there certainly is a move afoot now for people to be given options, so that, let's say, if you want to publish academically, there are just one or two roads to travel. You can, it depends on what you want to do, especially if you want to be highly critical of either, academia, because they're likely not going to publish you, but depending on the nature or the content of the work you're doing, it may be more beneficial to go that secondary route, to go sort of non-academic publishers. I think you're right. You read some of his stuff and it's like, it's kind of head scratching, but it's good to know that was its association. It kind of colors our reading of Lacan. Great session. I'm going to have to unfortunately close now, because I have another Zoom in literally 15 minutes with my other group. But thanks once again. So everybody is good for February 21st for the short kind of draft. Now, if you wish to submit it earlier, that's perfectly fine and get it done with. But we'll move it a little bit further back to give you a chance to work on it during the reading week. And then Judith, when you're done yours, submit it a couple of weeks after that, and we'll work out a schedule that's beneficial for everybody. So in the meantime, thanks everyone, and I will. I promise you, the movies get better. I keep learning, and so literally, there's my learning curve. They're a little less shouty. Anyway, take care. Have a wonderful week, and if you have any questions, stay in touch, and we'll talk to each other very soon. See ya.